Here's a quick video for my Biology for Health majors lab students on graphing, because not everyone's worked with graphing a lot before they get to this class. So we're going to talk about how to interpret graphs and how to build graphs. Now, in research, often the questions we ask for our research experiments have to do with the relationship between two different things. For example, how do nutrients affect growth or nutrition affect growth? How does stress affect behavior? Stress is one variable, behavior is another variable. How does age affect height? How does temperature affect leaf color? So in all of these questions that we've asked that we could design an experiment to test, there are two variables, and we're wondering about the relationship between these two variables. Now, in cases where you're comparing two variables, you're going to collect data on how these two variables are correlated or how they affect each other, and then you need to visualize that data. So you could collect data and just list the numbers, but the way human brains work, we're not very good at looking at a list of numbers and understanding intuitively what they mean. So if I just made two columns, a list of people's heights and a list of their weights, you could look at it and see that it was a list of numbers, but you wouldn't know necessarily what the relationship is just by looking at that list. So graphs are pictures that give us, as humans with human brains, an understanding of patterns and of relationships. It's a visual of the pattern. And so if you want to look at the patterns or relationships visually of two different variables, we can construct a two-dimensional graph that has two axes. So this horizontal line is an axis, and we call it the x-axis. X-axis. And then this vertical axis is the y-axis. And these could, extend indefinitely. So I just put little arrows there to indicate that they just keep going on and on, because there's an infinite number of numbers. So these axes will move on towards infinity, and they could also move in these opposite, towards the negative for infinity. The intersection here is 0 for both values. Now, when you're comparing two variables, you will have an independent variable and a dependent variable. The independent variable is always the x-axis, and dependent. The question is, how do you know which is the independent variable and which is the dependent variable? It's all very well to memorize that x is independent and y is dependent, but when we're talking about real life scenarios where you've asked a question, you've conducted an experiment, you've collected data, and now you want to present the data, you're going to have to figure out which axis to present which values, which data values. And these are just numbers, right? You have each of these intervals will be a different numeric interval. Depending on your data, they could be tens, ones, whatever. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you how to determine which variables you're experimenting with are dependent, which are independent, and how to interpret their data or place their data on a graph. So here are the lecture notes I've provided for your class. Like we just discussed, the x-axis is the horizontal axis, and it contains the data, or it displays the data for the independent variable. The y-axis is the vertical axis, and it displays the data for the dependent variable. So again, how do you know which variable you're experimenting with is dependent and which is independent? Well, it depends on the question you are asking, and also on your hypothesis. You look to your hypothesis to determine which of your two variables is dependent and which is independent. So example 1, you want to figure out which variable depends upon the other. So for example 1, let's just say you're experimenting with the height of children as they age. And so you want to look at how children grow as they get older. So then you would think to yourself, does a child's height depend upon their age, or does their age depend upon their height? Well, it's clearly that their height depends upon their age, right? So your hypothesis is, as they get older, it will make them taller. Not the other way around. They don't get older because they've gotten taller, right? So, I have written down here in notes for you, If you're tracking the growth of a child over time, you would hypothesize that the height of the child depends on their age or the time since birth. So height would be dependent. So if you say that your hypothesis is that the height of the child depends on their age, right? So height would be dependent. So height would be dependent. Because it would be pretty silly to say that the age of the child depends upon the height of the child, right? Because that would suggest that the child only gets older if they get taller. And the speed at which they get older is determined by their speed of growth. Like quickly growing children get older faster. And that, you know that that's not true. Their age is determined by the passage of time, which is not influenced by anything going on in the world around us. It just goes. Time, age, those are always going to be independent variables because they are not influenced. They don't depend upon anything in the world around us or in the universe around us that we are measuring in biology. You don't stop getting older just because you stop growing, okay? So back to our hypothesis here. Height depends upon age, not the other way around. The child's age is determined by time that's passed since birth, not the height of the child. The height of the child does not determine their age. But the age of the child could determine their height. So this means that height values are graphed against the y-axis and age is graphed against the x-axis because height is dependent and the y-axis is the dependent variable. Okay. So let's just take another quick example. Let's say another experiment you're doing is looking at how leaf colors change with the seasons. You know, they start out a very light green, they get a deeper green in the summer, and then they start, for many trees, they start to change colors to yellows or oranges or reds in the fall. So your hypothesis would be that leaf color depends upon the day or the month of the year. So leaf color would be the dependent. You, again, wouldn't say that the time of year depends on leaf color, because that would imply that if you went to a place where leaves didn't change color, where everything was an evergreen tree, that time stopped, that the days of the years no longer progressed, and that we know that that's not true. Time goes on regardless of what else is happening. It's dependent on nothing that we're doing our experiments on, and so some things can depend upon time, but time is always independent. So leaf color is the dependent here. It would go on the y-axis. Again, time or the day of the year, that would be independent. Now, I just told you that time is always independent. However, some variables can be dependent in some situations, but independent in others. For example, now you're doing another experiment. You're tracking the weight of children as they grow taller. So your variables are now weight and height. And you're probably hypothesizing that the weight of the child depends, at least in part, upon the child's height, meaning that the weight of the child depends largely on the child's height. So weight is depending on height, which means weight is the dependent variable and height would be independent. Now, in the last example, height was dependent. Remember, we were tracking, before, here's the graph from before. Height, we were hypothesizing, depends upon a child's age. A child's height depends in part upon their age. It doesn't mean age is the only predictor, because obviously nutrition and genetics also play a part. But we know for a fact that as a child ages, they get taller. And so certainly age predicts height. So height depends upon age to a certain extent. So we are, in our previous hypothesis, we hypothesized that a child's height depends upon how old they are, at least in part. And so height was the dependent variable. But now, when you're comparing a child's weight and height, your hypothesis is that their weight depends upon their height. As a child gets taller, the child almost certainly gets heavier. Right? So weight is fairly dependent upon height. We probably don't think that height depends upon weight, because just because a child gets heavier does not mean that the child will get taller, right? But we know as they get taller, they will get heavier. So in the last example, height was depending upon age, and so height was dependent. In this example, weight depends upon height, so height is independent, and weight is dependent. So again, you have to look to your hypothesis. And my advice to you, so you have to figure out what two variables are you comparing? What two variables are you hypothesizing there's a relationship between in the experiment at hand? And then say it two different ways. So you said, okay, I'm looking at weight and I'm looking at height, child weight and child height. And then say it both ways. A child's weight depends upon how tall they are, or how tall a child is depends upon how heavy they are. And which of those makes most sense to you, that's going to tell you which is your independent variable and which is your dependent variable for making a graph to display the data. Now, in terms of reading these graphs, let me go up again. Ooh, no. In terms of reading these graphs, let me go up again here. So there's a little dot up here, right? So what does that dot mean? What does that dot tell you? Well, it tells you both the height and age of this child. You have to follow a line straight down to the x-axis and look at the number there. And we've said, okay, age is in months, so we know this isn't 30 years or 30 days or 30 hours, it's months. You have to, when you build a graph, please remember to include units. Because if this month wasn't there, age, is it hours, days? Are we talking about infants? Are we talking about toddlers? Are we talking about across a person's entire lifetime? Because easily you could be checking the height of 30-year-olds. No, this is months. That's very important to know right up front so that, makes it easier for the person reading the graph to know what you're talking about without having to guess. So this is 30 months. That's about 2.5 years. So now you know the age of the child. And if you want to figure out how tall this child was at that time, all you have to do is draw a straight line, 90 degrees to the previous line, over to the y-axis and see what number is there, 80. And so you already know that this is centimeters, so 80 centimeters. Now, you've been learning conversions in class. You could convert this to meters. If you wanted to do a little more math, you could convert it to feet or inches, if that's more familiar to you. But now you have the information you need to know how tall this child was when they were 2.5 years old. And similarly, if we went down to this graph, you could do the same thing. So this graph is showing weight by height instead of height by age. So you're not going to find out how old this child is in this graph, but you can figure out what their height is. Again, we have 80 centimeters, just like before. And if we go over here, we already learned from the previous graph that they were 2.5 years old, but now we might want to know how heavy they were. 9. 9 what? 9 what? If you didn't put units in here, that would be super frustrating for the person trying to read the graph. Please remember your units on the graph axes. So this is 9 kilometers, not pounds. Oops, excuse me, not kilometers either, not pounds, not kilometers, kilograms. Now that you have this number, if you want to convert it to pounds, ounces, grams, whatever you want, you have the power to do that. But you have a value now for this child, and it's accurate because you know what the units are. So that explained how to interpret data on a graph, but what if you're trying to make a graph, to build a graph of data that you've collected? So you just have to do that process in reverse. So again, let's say you're trying to look at how children grow over time or how your child grew over time. So the data you have is you have a child who's 2.5 years old and they're 9 kilograms. That's around 30 pounds. So you have to find that one data point on your graph that represents both of those values, the weight value and the age value. Again, that means you need a child weight by age graph. So you first have to figure out, you know your two variables, you have weight and you have age. I've already told you time, age, things like that, they're always independent. So you're going to hypothesize weight depends upon the child's age. So weight depends upon their age. Their age doesn't depend on their weight. If they lose weight, they don't get younger, right? But usually as they get older, they get heavier because they get taller, right? So weight depends upon their age. So you would put weight on the dependent axis, the y-axis, and age on the independent axis, or the x-axis. Maybe you want to present by months, maybe you want to present by years. I have it by months here. So you would have to figure out, you have to convert 2.5 years to months. Well, each year is 12 months. So if you have 2.5 years, you have 12 months plus 12 months, that's 2 years, right? Plus half a year, that's going to be 6 months, and that's going to be 30 months total. Okay, so there's your 30 there for age. So age was 30 months of this child. And also, you know that they're 9 kilograms. So you set up your axis to include, it has to go, the value of 30 has to appear on your x-axis. The value of 9 has to appear on your y-axis. And you find out where those, after you build the axes, you find out where those two values intersect. So you would draw a line, an imaginary line upwards, and an imaginary line sidewards, and you'd find where those two lines intersect. That line there is 30 on the x-axis and 9 on the y-axis. Okay, that tells you both the age on the x-axis, that value on the x-axis, and the 9 value, the weight value from the y-axis, all in one data point. Okay. Similarly, if a child is 9 kilograms and 80 centimeters tall, which is around 31 inches, you can find where you should place that point as well. So you have 80 centimeters. Again, so you can put height down here. You have height. You think that weight depends upon height. So weight is the dependent variable, goes on the y-axis. Height is the independent variable on the x-axis. You know that the child you're trying to put down data for is 80 centimeters. So that means when you're making your tick marks, dividing up the possible heights that you're showing on your x-axis, 80 has to be included. So as long as 80 is included, you're good. Again, you know that you have 9 kilograms, so as you're deciding what values, how to divide up the weights that you show on the y-axis, you know that 9 has to be included somewhere. So you have 9 included up here, you have 80 included over here, and you just have to find where they intersect. That's your data point. That is 80 centimeters by 9 kilograms. Let's talk about interpolation and extrapolation. Often you're not going to be building a graph to graph one data point because you don't need to. If I just tell you this child is 80 centimeters tall and 9 kilograms heavy, then you'll know, you can keep that information in your head. But what if you had a list of data points for this one child? So you had a list of heights. So let's talk about centimeters. Okay, so this is one child, and you have a list of heights. You have 40, 50. You measured their weight when they were each of these heights. So 60 centimeters, 70 centimeters, and 80. And so while they were at these heights, you also know their weight. So you know the kilograms that they weigh, the amount of kilograms. So when they were 40 centimeters tall or long, they were 2.5 kilograms. When they were 50 centimeters tall, they were 3.25 kilograms. When they were 60 centimeters tall, they were 6 kilograms. And I did look up what is somewhat normal values for children, for these lengths and weights. At 70 centimeters tall, the child might have been 8 kilograms, and at 80, we already put 9 kilograms. Okay, so now if you were to just look at that list, that's not very easy to interpret, the pattern of growth for this child. So you would want to graph all of the data points to get a sense of how this child was growing. So again, you would look at, so this is your list of data that you collected. This is your data collection part, and now you need the data presentation part in the graph. So let's work backward from the 80. We already did 80 and 9. So let's do 70 now. So 70, we go up, and we find where it intersects with 8. Because when they were 70 centimeters tall, they were 8 around 8 kilograms, okay? So there's that data point. That shows you the 8 here and where it intersected with the 70 centimeters here. All right, when they were 60 centimeters tall, they were, 6 kilograms. So that's going to be here. And this is why graphs, I don't have to draw the line because this graph already has lines. That makes it a little bit easier to both to create the graph and to interpret it. And then at 50 centimeters, this child was 3 1/4. So that's going to be like around there. And then finally at 40, this is the earliest data point we have, 2.5 kilograms. So that's going to be there. So you're seeing this kind of like, maybe a curvy line like that perhaps. Now what people will do is they will plot all of these data points without a line, like that, and then they'll get a computer program to figure out an equation for a line that is the best fit to this data. Best fit means the line that passes through these data points are as close as possible to every data point. So you have very little deviation from the line, or as little deviation from the line as possible. Whether that's going to be a straight line or a curved line depends on your data. So I'm just going to estimate here. So let's say that that's our line. Okay. The reason for doing that is because if you get a line, if you find an equation for a line that describes the data, then you can estimate values for which you don't actually have data. So for example, I didn't collect data on this child's weight when they were 55 centimeters high. I don't know their weight. I didn't actually measure it. So I don't actually know how heavy they were when they were 55 centimeters. But if I have this line here that estimates the relationship between height and weight, then I can go up to the line and I can say, well, and I probably should be doing this in a different color, right, to show that this isn't data that I actually have. So this in red, this is my estimated data. I wonder how heavy this child was when they were 55 centimeters long. Well, based on where this line was that estimates the relationship between height and weight, I would say that at 55 centimeters, this child was probably something around, 4.5 kilograms. Probably around 4.5 kilograms. 4.5 kilograms. That's an estimate. I didn't actually measure it. I didn't actually put the child on a scale when they were 55 centimeters. So I don't know how heavy they were. But because I have all this other data in purple where I had real measurements, I can use that data to estimate for values I didn't actually collect data for. They probably didn't grow like this and then shrink again. That's probably not what happened. That wouldn't make any sense. So I can be pretty sure that they weren't very far off of this line. So that's called interpolation. Interpolation. We also have extrapolation. Extrapolation is when so in interpolation, I was estimating weight for values of height that I didn't collect data on, but they were within my data set range. Like I measured between 40 and 80 centimeters, and 55 is between 40 and 80. Extrapolation is when you go outside your data range of what you actually collected. So like that would be, 100. 100 is not within the data range that I actually collected data for. It's outside the range. My range was 40 to 80. 100 is outside, it's greater than 80. So this is, I can still use my line to estimate, but I have to hope that the line just keeps going the way that it keeps following the same pattern. So if it does, then, my weight value would be up here. So that's going to be, if we did approximately the same. So 11, 12, 13, I'm just estimating, 14 kilograms, 15, 16, 17. So I'm predicting, the future here. I'm saying I think that in the future, when this child is 100 centimeters tall, they're going to be 17 kilograms in their weight, based on this line that I used to fit the data that I had so far. So that's extrapolation, because that's outside. So extrapolation is outside the range of data you collected. And there are problems with that because, as you know, this line isn't going to continue at this pattern. Growth eventually stops, tapers off, flat lines. We don't grow forever as we get older. So maybe within a close range, if you're extrapolating not too far out, you could probably still get a good estimate. But if you're extrapolating really far out, there's a lot of things that a lot of assumptions you're making that might make your estimates quite flawed, like growth stopping or changing pattern over time.